Whenever you look at theory, you see this implicit assumption that all of the groups are very similar in their capabilities, what they want to do, and so forth. When you look at facts, you find disparate impacts everywhere. Is that all differences between groups must be due or presumptively due to mistreatment by others. And they are really pretty impervious to evidence. And what makes them tremendously dangerous is that facts that contradict what they believe are simply ignored or evaded.
Welcome to the Thomas Sowell channel. Today we're going to talk about Kamala Harris's new plan to make it so that all racial groups will die from coronavirus at equal rates. And we'll also discuss why coronavirus doesn't really care what Kamala thinks. I'll let Kamala herself explain how she plans to achieve health equality.
And we know that this virus, it preys on people with pre-existing conditions. And so we've seen Blacks and Latinos twice as likely to die from this virus. One of the great things I love about our plan is that it takes into account racial disparities. It acknowledges it so that we make sure that we're putting resources in the communities that need them and do it in a way that everyone comes out equal.
Kamala is right. The rate of death for coronavirus is almost completely contingent on the severity and the number of pre-existing conditions. The CDC says 94% of COVID-19 deaths had underlying medical conditions. However, here's where I differ with Kamala Harris. What makes Kamala think that simply by changing the allocation of how financial resources are spent will by itself be capable of equalizing outcomes across racial groups that differ greatly in their rate of pre-existing conditions? It is true that blacks are dying at twice the rate of white Americans from coronavirus. But what is not mentioned is that Asians are dying at even lower rates than whites. Diabetes is one of the most common pre-existing conditions for coronavirus. Blacks are dying at more than twice the rate of Asian Americans. But Black Americans also have twice the rate of diabetes compared to Asian Americans. Is it that surprising that a group with twice the rate of diabetes will also have twice the rate of coronavirus deaths? Let's see what Thomas Sowell has to say about these expectations for equal outputs from groups with wildly different inputs.
If all the background conditions are such as would lead to equality of outcomes,
Right.
and you find great inequalities, then somebody must have messed with it.
Right.
But as economic historian David Landy said, the world has never been a level playing field. It's not a level playing field geographically, culturally, politically, you name it, it's not. The very notion that you would expect groups to be evenly represented is staggering when you realize the tremendous difference in backgrounds from which all groups come.
That still leaves the question as to why there are such huge disparities. It's amazing how many of the people who find these disparities both offensive and puzzling never look at the disparities in inputs behind the disparities in outputs.
The more things you hold constant, the more these numbers tend to shrink. Unfortunately, after all this time, no one has bothered that I know of to try to eliminate differences of age, differences of education, and particularly qualitative differences in education, and try to see how much is left after you've done all of that. It begins to fall away pretty rapidly, though, with some of those things.
In his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, Thomas Sowell describes why Kamala must use external causation to explain this disparity in outputs while ignoring the differences in inputs. External explanations of black-white differences, discrimination or poverty, for example, seem to many to be more amenable to public policy than internal explanations such as culture. Those with this point of view tend to resist cultural explanations. Alternative explanations of economic and social lags provide a more satisfying ability to blame all such lags on the sins of others, such as racism or discrimination. Equally important, such external explanations require no painful internal changes in the black population, but leave all the changes to whites, who are seen as needing to be harangued, threatened, or otherwise forced to change. Now, Thomas Sowell has a very similar kind of example to explain the different mortgage rejection rates by blacks, whites, and Asians without using the external causation of racism.
For example, the housing situation. When they discovered that blacks were turned down for prime mortgage loans at a higher rate than whites, instantly the media decided that was due to racial discrimination. Now, if you look at the same data from which they get the statistics on blacks and whites, and look at the statistics for Asian Americans, it undermines that completely. For example, when blacks were turned down at a rate nearly double that of whites, at the very same time, whites were turned down at a rate nearly double that of Asian Americans. Moreover, black-owned banks turned down blacks at a still higher rate than the white-owned banks did. And so you find it very hard to reconcile this with what they believe. But there's a tendency among intellectuals to have a certain set of preconceptions. And when they find numbers that seem to fit that preconception, they don't go any further. And so they have no reason to look up the data for Asian Americans, which undermines the whole argument they've made.
Do you see the pattern between these two situations with coronavirus and housing? You have three groups, black, white, and Asian. Politicians are greatly interested in the black-white gap because that proves systemic racism, and it gives the politician a mandate to spend lots of other people's money because of its external causation. Society, racism, or poverty, which all theoretically can be fixed by spending other people's money.
One of the great things I love about our plan is that it takes into account racial disparities. It acknowledges it so that we make sure that we're putting resources in the communities that need them and do it in a way that everyone comes out equal.
While the white-Asian gap is ignored because it implies internal causation with differences of culture, attitude, and behavior that cannot be fixed by Kamala spending other people's money. Groups that differ in inputs will also typically differ in outputs, and there's nothing Kamala or any other politician can do about it, no matter how much money they spend or how pretty their words. Now, let's take a look at the final clips from Thomas Sowell and Jordan Peterson discussing how politicians aiming for equal outcomes historically is one of the fastest ways to tear a society apart.
You are opposed to equality of outcome.
Equality of outcome. I can't imagine anything we could possibly strive for in our society that would make it into hell faster than equality of outcome. Like the historical evidence for the pathology of that route is so strong. It's like you have to be historically ignorant beyond belief or malevolent or resentful beyond comprehension in order to think that that's a good idea.
You write in Intellectuals in Race that the kind of society to which that can lead when you talk about the race industry, et cetera, and emotion, is one in which a newborn baby enters the world supplied with pre-packaged grievances against other babies born the same day.
Yes. Yes. This idea that you can redress history, which we see in a specific context in this country, it's around the world. I mean, the Czechs, when they first formed Czechoslovakia after the First World War, one of the goals they had was to redress the injustices of the 17th century. You know, nobody from the 17th century was alive at the end of the First World War. And so they tried to take this out by having policies that would favor the Czechs over the Germans and so on. And they set in motion a chain of events in which Czechs and Germans were both worse off than they had ever been before, and both were victims of tragedy, trying to undo what happened to people who are now long dead.
And what makes them tremendously dangerous is that facts that contradict what they believe are simply ignored or evaded.